Hello, and thank you for your interest in my latest masterclass, which, as you can see, is called Strategy Diagnostics, because it's about testing your marketing strategy before you implement it. It's aimed particularly at marketers and other commercial people in pharma and medtech industry, which is, the sector that I concentrate my research into. So it's always good to start a presentation with things that the audience will agree with. So I'm going to start with what I think we can all agree to be self-evident. Making a marketing strategy is a costly, labour-intensive process, but even that resource is small in comparison to the resource required to execute it. So it makes sense, therefore, that before you reach that hockey stick of implementing your strategy, that you test it. And it also makes sense that what you're testing for is its likelihood of success or failure, its probability that it will succeed. And also that, like any good diagnostic, what those tests should tell you is not only will it succeed or fail, but what you can do to improve the probability of it succeeding. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to start by comparing it with other aspects of our everyday life and indeed other aspects of the pharmaceutical and medtech value chain. Because, of course, we wouldn't dream of buying a house or a car or boarding an airplane unless we knew the checks had been done first. Pre-flight checks on an airplane, a survey on a house, an inspection on a car. And exactly the same idea applies in our industry. We have rules in manufacturing and clinical trials and R&D laboratories that anticipate what might go wrong and are designed to mitigate the risk that anything will go wrong. So that's almost the definition of professionalism in those areas. But what about in marketing? What pre-flight checks do we do on our marketing strategy before we execute it? We have very strong processes and quite often elaborate processes for making a marketing strategy in pharma and medtech, but where are the protocols for checking it has no flaws and optimizing the probability that it will succeed? Well, the truth is that we don't have those processes generally. Most pharma and medtech companies, the process for checking strategy, if you can call that, is a socialization process. That is, we talk about it. And if everybody's happy, everybody's aligned, as we call it, then we proceed. There is no equivalent to the formal, rigorous process that our colleagues use in other areas of the business. In this respect, at least, marketers are relatively unprofessional. So, how can we improve that situation? Well, we can learn a lot from the aviation industry, where their safety record is impeccable. Something like 1 fatality every 3 million journeys. It used to be much worse, of course, and the way that the aviation industry improved that situation is by looking at the crashes, working at what went wrong by looking at flight recorders and so on, and then using that information to improve the design of the aircraft and, importantly, to decide what to check on the airplane before it took off. So, the question is, could we do something similar for marketing strategy? And that's what I spend much of my time doing. In fact, I've been researching this topic for 20 years now, and for 20 years before that, I worked in the industry making marketing strategies. So in this presentation, I'm going to try and give you an overview of what I've learned. There are many reasons, of course, that an airplane crash, but the airplane can crash, but the interesting thing is that a small number of reasons account for almost all causes of aircraft failure. And the same is true in marketing strategy. When I speak to marketers in pharma and medtech and say, what went wrong with your strategy? And usually it comes down to a small number of reasons. So let me walk through that. The first thing that I hear when I talk to marketers is that my strategy failed because some of the customers loved us, but not enough. Now, this occurs, of course, because not all our customers are the same, so they don't always respond the same way to a value proposition. The problem it causes is that if only 20% of your customers respond to your effort, then the other 80% of your effort is probably wasted, and you get a low overall ROI. And because this is a problem of customers being different from each other, let's call it the market heterogeneity problem. The second thing that I hear most often is the issue that the customers like this, but not enough to change their embedded behavior. Let's call this the market inertia problem. And it's very common in pharma and medtech. That customers will see a product and like it, but they won't change their practice. The third problem, I say, is one that we might call the David and Goliath problem. So where this market strategy competes against a large dominant incumbent, but that incumbent has a much greater resource superiority. The fourth cause of failure of marketing strategies that I hear about is slightly different. It's not to do with superiority of resources, but it's when the competitor has a strength in, say, the performance factor of the brand, or a strong brand name, or low cost, for example. Okay, and in this situation, the problem is not that there's anything wrong with our strategy, it's just their strategies. They're better at implementing their strategy. And then the final thing that comes out of this research is that the market has moved on. Our strategy would have worked, but we failed to anticipate the way that the market would move on. Very common, of course, because of the social and technological change in our industry. So let's just call this the market change issue. So think about what these 5 common dominant failure patterns tell us. What they tell us is that any one or any combination of these 5 factors could cause a marketing strategy to fail. But to succeed, a marketing strategy has to address all 5 of these issues. In other words, there are lots of ways to crash, only one way to fly. This explains the high failure rate of marketing strategies. So now let's try to move on to what we might do to address this situation. I'm going to argue that it's not too difficult to address the situation, but you do need a methodical process, like good clinical practice or good laboratory practice. Okay. That starts with defining what your marketing strategy is. And that might seem like a semantic point, but it's important because in areas like clinical trials, for instance, everybody agrees what their terms mean. Epoch, ARM, observational study, they all have precise definitions. But when you ask a group of marketers to define what a marketing strategy is, you get many different answers. And you can't test a marketing strategy until you've defined what it is. So the second stage is diagnosis, that is finding out the relative importance of each of these 5 factors, that is how much at risk your strategy is of these 5 possible failures. And then that leads on to the third stage, the therapy stage, because each of the different problems has a different therapy approach as well. So let's begin with that thing about how do we define a marketing strategy. The point I would like you to grasp is that a good definition of marketing strategy is what segments and what value propositions you're offering. Quite often, marketing strategies are conflated with or confused with higher levels of strategy, corporate business unit level strategy, or lower levels of strategy like marketing communication strategy or market access strategy. Or sometimes they're conflated with tactics. They're none of those things. Your marketing strategy is your choice of what segment and value proposition. Now, I'm going to ask you to pause the video for just a moment there to write down what you would describe as your marketing strategy using that format, using that definition, because you'll get a lot more out of what comes next if you've written down a clear definition of your strategy there. Okay, so let me assume that you've done that. Let's move on to how we begin to test it. The place to start is with target market risk. This risk that only some customers will respond. In all of these tests, I use a template. This is a simplified version of the template I use for this test. And in here you can see 5 examples of how firms in pharma and medtech typically define their target market segment. And each of these 5 different definitions has a different level of target market risk. So defining your market in terms of a product or a procedure or a disease has a high level of risk. Defining it in terms of a decision context has a lower level of risk. Later, I'll discuss a methodology for reducing this risk, but for now, it's important that you understand the significance of this important and very common weakness in marketing strategy. The next thing to move on to is to look at managing proposition risk and predicting proposition risk, the risk that the market won't move. So this is the case where you have to address market inertia. Again, here's a simplified version of the template that we use in practice, and this involves comparing what you're offering the target segment against what your main competitor does. It's important for you to do this objectively through the eyes of the customer, and that you consider not just the product but the whole value proposition. As you can see, inferior offers create very high levels of proposition risk. Superior offers create low levels of proposition risk. Again, you can look at this, compare it to your strategy statement, and assign yourself a level of risk along this dimension. The third step of strategy diagnostics is to address this David and Goliath problem, the differentiation risk problem. Here, again, using a simplified template, the high differentiation risk is associated with an undifferentiated strategy where you target the same segment and with the same sort of value proposition, with the same sort of assets and resources as your competition does. Low levels of differentiation risk come from when you sidestep the competition, when you try to target a different target segment with a different value proposition, with different sorts of resources. Again, there are methods for addressing this, which we'll come on to later, but this is the third of the 5 tests. And the fourth is alignment risk. Alignment risk is the problem that occurs when you're not using your strengths or your weaknesses, or vulnerable to the strengths of the competition. If you wish to have a low level of alignment risk, then what you have to do is objectively assess your strengths and weaknesses and align them to objectively assess opportunities and threats. If you don't do that, if you don't align the interior to the exterior, then you have very high levels of risk. Again, we'll talk about a tool for addressing this in a moment. And then the fifth and final of these 5 tests is the one that concerns predicting future risk, the degree to which your strategy risks being left behind by the future. Strategies that don't anticipate the future, that assume the market is staying broadly the same as it is, have very high levels of risk. Strategies which look at what's driving the market and identify emerging opportunities and threats, and therefore choose their segments, target segments and value propositions accordingly, tend to have low levels of risk. So there we have 5 templates, and you're seeing the simplified versions, and you can compare your marketing strategy statement to these 5 templates, and for each of these 5 dimensions you can see whether your risk is high, low, or very high, very low, or moderate. What that process allows you to do is construct a simple radar chart like this. In this example, then you can see that the blue strategy has relatively high levels of risk, especially future risk, and that the red strategy has relatively low levels of risk, although it could be managed better on its alignment risk. Okay. So you can compare the risk profiles of 2 strategies, but importantly, this tells you not only the relative probability of the strategy succeeding, but it directs your efforts to how you can improve it. In this case, the blue strategy, future risk; in this case, the red strategy, alignment risk. So I've now given you some idea of how to define your marketing strategy and how to assess it, so you get a relatively objective way of assessing your strategy. If you're lucky and you're working with one of those companies with lots of quantitative market research data, you can do this in a very quantitative way. But my experience is that even if you can't do that, even if you do this with just get the right people around the table to discuss this qualitatively, this process can significantly improve the strength of your marketing strategy. So I'm now going to move on to what you might do to improve your marketing strategy. Now, I don't have time in this webinar to cover all of these tools, but I'm just going to touch on them. Okay? I will say that if you want more details and step-by-step approach to doing this, then it's all detailed in my book, Marketing Therapy. So let's begin, for instance, supposing you test use the strategy diagnostics and you determine that your marketing strategy has a high degree of target market risk. Well, target market risks arises from the heterogeneity of the market, and it's very common in our industry because we tend to define segments in terms of prescriber behaviour or professional behaviour or disease category, and that's just one dimension. The reality is, of course, that the decision is made in multiple dimensions in a context defined by the payer's needs and wants, the professional's needs and wants, and the patient's needs and wants. So contextual segmentation is a methodology for defining segments in this way. I'm going to address this methodology, in fact, in a later webinar. Supposing that your strategy diagnostics tell you that you have relatively high proposition risk, a high degree of market inertia. Well, the way you address this is with a tool called the Extended Augmented Value Proposition Model. What this tool does is it takes your contextual segment and it identifies the different levels of layers of needs that drive the behaviour of that segment, and it leads you to devise a multi-layered value proposition that addresses those needs. Again, we'll be discussing this in a later webinar. If your strategy diagnostics tell you that you've got a David and Goliath problem, and this is how you approach it. The only way to address the David and Goliath problem is to somehow avoid direct competition, to focus your resources in a part of the market where you're relatively strong. And what that does is, although it doesn't reduce the overall resource imbalance, it creates a localized superiority of resource. The tool for doing this is Focus Matrix, and again, we'll do this in a later webinar, but it's a very powerful, straightforward tool to use. If in your fourth strategy diagnostic test you identify alignment risk, then this is an issue of not being able to leverage your strengths in the market or not being able to mitigate your weaknesses. There are two tools that I recommend for this. The first one, called Reality Filters, is a tool for identifying what are really your strengths and weaknesses, what are really your opportunities and threats, and therefore improving the inputs into your SWOT process. And then the second tool takes the traditional SWOT analysis process, which isn't really very helpful at all, and makes it much more powerful by aligning those internal and external factors to identify the critical success factors of your strategy. So that's the fourth test. We'll be covering this in a later webinar too. And then the final thing we talked about is future risk. When the market moves on, the tool for avoiding and mitigating this risk is called emergent properties analysis, which instead of looking at how the market is changing, looks at how the environment around the market is changing, because that shapes your market. And again, we'll be doing this, in fact, in the next masterclass next month. So those are the 5 tools that you can use for managing and mitigating the weaknesses that you might identify in the diagnostic phase of the process. I've only touched them briefly, but they're all covered in the book I mentioned, and they're all covered in future webinars. Let me summarize, if I can, in this one short slide. If you accept my premise that professionalism is about methodically maximizing success and minimizing failure, then I think it's indisputable that many marketers are rather less professional than their colleagues in other functions like R&D or clinical trials or manufacturing. But that can be corrected. There are practical and applicable methods to professionalize the marketing strategy process, which I've briefly overviewed today, and I've given much more detail in my work. And those ways of assessing the strategy diagnostics, inform the way you can improve the strategy and minimize the risk of failure, which of course goes back to our definition of strategy. Professional strategy and professionalism. So thank you for your interest and your attention to these informal webinars. I hope you find it interesting, and most of all, I hope you find it useful. If you would like to know more, then you can follow my work on Twitter or on my YouTube channel, or buy my books on Amazon, and look at my website. But my favourite way would be for you to get in touch. If you're interested in any of this work and how you might practically and usefully apply it in your pharma or medtech company, then drop me an email at this address, brian.smith@pragmatic.com, and I'll be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good evening.